Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. So it's time to see what's making the headlines with Mark Wallace, Chief Executive of Conservative Home, and Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer. They're with us, of course, right now, from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. Front pages, though, let's start with the Metro. Says the Taliban has been holding fake funerals with coffins draped in Western flags carried through the streets as the militant group declared victory in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, The Guardian pictures the last US soldier to board a plane leaving Afghanistan, marking the end of 20 years of US involvement. President Biden said the end of US involvement in Afghanistan is also the end of attempts to nation build. That's on the front of the Telegraph. The Daily Mirror reports hundreds of thousands of patients will be offered a jab to reduce their cholesterol levels, slashing their risk of a heart attack. The Financial Times says high inflation in the Eurozone is putting pressure on the European Central Bank to end its stimulus policies. To the front of the Sun now, Geronimo is put down after a legal battle to save the alpaca after he tested positive for bovine TB. Well, Mark and Sonia are here with their thoughts, and not surprising, many of the newspapers still leading with Afghanistan. A really resonant speech tonight from Joe Biden. Sonia, the Daily Telegraph picking up on that, as he suggested this was not just about Afghanistan. This was really drawing a line under 20 years of American foreign policy.
Absolutely. I think what we saw President Joe Biden do this evening was to really double down in his defence of the American actions in Afghanistan in recent weeks, but also to extend it to America's wider foreign policy. And for close watchers of Joe Biden, who've been following his views on foreign policy, back when he was vice president to President Obama, this shouldn't come as a massive surprise because Biden has always been much less interventionist than Obama. And in this speech, he set out two clear benchmarks for US intervention in wars in the future, which is that it has to be in the US national interest and they have to be clear and achievable objectives. Now, if you go back to America's original action in Afghanistan, I'm sure those involved with it would say that there were clear objectives. But I think this is Biden really sort of actually being quite Trumpian in some ways in terms of his foreign policy. It's very much America first. And he's basically saying to the rest of the world, look, you can't expect us to be the world's policeman anymore. And I think what that does to the sort of global order, what it means for alliances such as NATO, these are all really big questions, I think, that the world is going to have to work through, because historically and in recent years, the rest of the world has to the US to play this role in foreign policy. And I think it's worth saying as well that Biden absolutely doubles down. He defends the chaotic evacuation that has left sort of many Afghans who work with the British and US and other foreign governments stranded in Afghanistan. It's left, British citizens stranded in Afghanistan. He sort of doubles down, defends that, and says it was the right thing to do. But there are huge questions overhanging America's policy.
Yes, leave or escalate, he kept saying, didn't he? And also asking, what was really a speech for the American people, remind people, why did we go there in the first place, Mark? We were chasing down terrorists. It morphed into nation building. And the question then at the door of the old hands of George W. Bush and Tony Blair about how it morphed, how they were there so long. If it was Yemen, would we still be there? We have no national interests beyond why we went originally. I mean, it was a fascinating speech, really, resetting where he sees America and where he sees the threat now in the world of geopolitics.
Well, it was a fascinating and quite depressing exercise, I think, in reverse engineering an argument and an opinion to fit the situation he currently finds himself in. But really, this is the worst end of the scale of possible things to learn about Joe Biden's policy. It means that what we've seen in his policy towards Afghanistan, precipitous, rushed, poorly planned abandonment of not just a nation to terrorists and extremists, but of allies, closed, poor communication, even within the Western alliance, a great gift to tyrants, terrorists, any other group, frankly, looking to see how they might be able to get one over on people who value democracy and freedom, now has a little manifesto, a little blueprint of how to do it, and evidence that it is possible to bore and bleed the United States into retreat. And he said, that isn't just Afghanistan, that's my policy towards the whole world. And I think that's an extremely troubling thing to do. All those people in the last 20, 30 years who, whether they're from the far left, Yankees go home, troops out kind of campaign, whether they're from the right, the kind of Trumpist, not our problem, shrug at the troubles of the world position, they've both now got what they want. And the tragedy is this is an outcome of a bipartisan consensus in Washington for a world without, fundamentally a world without America. And I fear we're only just starting to see the first people suffering as a result of that, and they won't be the last.
Yeah, that is the big picture stuff, isn't it? The first draft of history as we look back on this episode. We're still in the minutiae too, though, aren't we, Sonia? The Daily Telegraph reporting that senior British intelligence officials held secret talks with the Taliban in Kabul to seek assurances that Afghanistan will not be used to launch terrorist attacks on the West. The discussions are understood to have taken place in the past fortnight in the wake of the fall of the Afghan capital and the Taliban seizure of power. And on top of that, Downing Street has confirmed tonight that the Prime Minister's special representative for Afghan transition, Simon Gass, has travelled to Doha and is meeting senior Taliban representatives to underline the importance of safe passage. This is interesting, isn't it? And could it be seen as a first step in the future to recognition of the Taliban as legitimate government? Or is it just a means to an end for now?
Well, I'm not sure about that full step of recognition of the Taliban as Afghan's official government. It's hard to see that happening in the near future. But I think it is an example of the British government recognising that it has to work pragmatically. I think once the US decided to withdraw in the manner that it's done, what choice does the British government have in many ways but to open up talks with the Taliban? I think this story does, though, sort of put paid to what Biden tried to say in his speech, which is that there's a complete separation between, America's national interests, getting the terrorists, and nation building. What his speech got wrong is that actually, nation building, but doing what you can to bolster democratic institutions, that can actually be part of building global security and preventing terrorist attacks in the future. Now, that clearly hasn't worked in Afghanistan with this American withdrawal, but the fact that you've got the head of MI6 and Secret Services talking not just to Pakistan, as you'd expect, but to the Taliban about, really sort of trying to set a red line in terms of that they're not going to get any aid from the West, for example, if they do allow the sorts of terrorism flourish that we saw, back with Al-Qaeda, back in 2001. I think this is representative of just a certain amount of pragmatism, really.
Yes, realpolitik, as we used to hear. To the Metro now, Mark. Death to the West. These are coffins draped in Western flags carried by the Taliban as they mocked the West and declared victory in Afghanistan. Liberation from their point of view, I would say. What do you think?
I think, unfortunately, liberation for the cat is death for the mouse, and liberation for the Taliban is death for an awful lot of other people. And I think this front page, that image there, and the slogan that's being chanted is just a taster of that huge fistful of salt that's got to come with all these claims about Taliban 2.0, the idea that you could have a Taliban who'll promise, with a cherry on top, not to be a source of hostile extremism against the West. For that matter, the idea that the Taliban can even control all of Afghanistan. The Taliban themselves, as you see very clearly there, are Islamist extremist, violent, militant Islamist extremists. That's really their thing, let's be honest. And they are virulently poisonous and active against the West's not interest. But we've also literally just seen ISIS Khorasan, ISIS-K, carry out suicide bombing attack against Western troops right under the Taliban's noses. Now, the Taliban say that they weren't in any way complicit in that, and ISIS-K are their deadly enemies. Well, in that case, it's quite clear that they cannot guarantee that terrorists acting against the West will not be operating in their territory. They've just taken over Afghanistan, this is already happening.
Yes, we'd seen them earlier, hadn't we? The Taliban fighters parading in American uniforms with American weapons. More pictures this evening, Sonia, of them inspecting some of the spoils of war, some also which had been destroyed by the Americans. Demilitarized, I think they called it last night. Not the fire trucks and not the low loaders, because they want this airport to reopen. But the new images are fascinating. Let's just have a look at those pictures. Lots left behind, as you can see, burnt out, $62 billion worth of equipment. But the Americans learnt one lesson, I suppose, and tried to destroy some of it at least. The Metro also has elements of this too. Taliban's new toys, they say, with one Talib fighter taking a selfie in the cockpit of an Afghan Air Force plane as well. There's a lot of kit left behind.
There's a lot of kit, and as you just said, Anna, the US troops have sort of ruined some of it, demilitarized some of it, burnt it out, etc. So it's not usable. But there's a big question mark about how much is left and usable, and there's huge concerns in the US that that there are working Black Hawks, the military helicopters, that there are Humvees, that there are thousands of machine guns that can be used. So really a huge military stash, some of which may have been taken out into service, like these images that we're seeing at the moment. But I think there's a lot of concern in the US that much of it is still used. And one American opposition politician has sort of accused Biden of leaving the Taliban with more Black Hawk helicopters than 85% of countries in the world.
And just a quick word on the Guardian front page. It pictures the last US soldier leaving last night, but it has word on the impact of the women, the scepticism that you talked about earlier, Mark, on how the Taliban will behave towards people there.
Yes, a heartrending interview that opens this piece with a lady in Afghanistan who's been burning her jeans and Western clothes. And it's a reminder that, as much as people talk about that really shameful, era-defining image of that last soldier leaving, they talk about this as the end of the war in Afghanistan. For most Afghans, this is, just the start of a new chapter of it.